At the quietest and most lifeless hour of this beautiful town, a person can sometimes feel like a stranger, even inside their own home and surroundings. When you open an old window and look outside, you might see the lush green trees, the grass, and the dirt road stretching away, and then, as you lift your gaze slightly upward, you might notice something standing completely still under the pale light of a street lamp. During the day, the old and magnificent stone houses of the Cotswolds look like a work of art, like a painting. Honey-colored walls, ivy climbing across the stone, narrow paths, sheep visible behind wooden fences. But when night falls, everything becomes different. The wind moves through the stone, as if the stone itself no longer has any power to protect against it, howling through the streets and shifting even the memories and emotions inside the houses. Mara first noticed it that winter. Winters in the Cotswolds can be a little capricious and seem to enjoy frightening people. First the fog arrives, and the streets fall into a kind of white darkness. Then comes a damp cold without rain, and after that a strange silence settles in, rising out of the cold itself. Mara was 17 years old. She went to school, argued with her younger sister Isla, ignored her mother's warnings of "don't slam the door," and watched her father return home exhausted from work. From the outside, life seemed completely normal. They were an ordinary but happy English family. Her mother Helen worked part-time at the village library. It was as if she carried the secrets of people along with the dust of old books. But when she came home, she was still the same woman who ran the kitchen, lowered the heat under the soup by the stove, and brushed Isla's hair. Her father Richard was a stonemason, a craftsman who worked with stone. He tried to remain quiet and solid, like the walls of the Cotswolds themselves. Mara's younger sister Isla was 14 years old, and there was always an expression on her face as if she were about to ask a question. Her instincts were strong. If someone in the household had a problem, she was usually the first to sense it. They lived in a beautiful location, at the edge of the village, a house set slightly back from the road, surrounded by low stone walls and a small garden. In the corner of the garden stood an old apple tree, heavy with bright red fruit, and behind it, beyond the fences, dark fields stretched all the way to the horizon. Behind those fields stood the cemetery. It was a very old cemetery, old enough to have witnessed the very founding of England. In truth, it could hardly even be called a cemetery. It was more like the silent presence of stones leaning behind a church, stones that had perhaps witnessed nearly 1,000 years of time. The village church was called Saint Eadric Church. It had round-arched windows, a worn cross on its door, and moss-covered stones on its bell tower. During the day, tourists would arrive, take a few photographs, stand there for a couple of minutes, and then leave. But the villagers rarely went near the cemetery behind the church. Even on bright days, it seemed to remain like a dark shadow. Mara had gone to the cemetery once as a child. It was during a school trip. The teacher explained things as history. The students pushed each other playfully and tried to read the names on the gravestones. What Mara remembered most was not the names carved into the stones, but the silence beneath them. Some places seemed to whisper to you, "Don't stay here too long, leave." That day had whispered the same thing. Mara had felt it instinctively and listened. Then the years passed, and one night Mara heard her own footsteps. No one remembered the first night correctly, because the events did not begin with a great tragedy or a scream, nor did they begin with a dramatic breaking point. That morning Helen had called Mara to breakfast. Mara came to the table with bloodshot eyes, tangled hair, and dirt under her fingernails. Her mother first asked, "Did you have a dream?" Mara shrugged. Her father asked, "Were you wandering in the garden?" "I don't know," Mara replied. Ela noticed a thin scratch on her sister's wrist, the kind you might get from brushing against bushes. It didn't attract much attention, but the fact that it didn't attract attention was somehow more disturbing. Strangely, for the rest of the day, Mara carried the tiredness of a stranger on her face, not as if she had not slept, but as if she had slept somewhere completely unrelated to her own home. When a person sleeps in the wrong place, they wake up uneasy, as if searching for their own bed. The body does not truly rest, it simply freezes in place. At school, Mara drifted off into her thoughts. When her teacher called her name, she flinched. When her friends joked around, she forced a smile. It was as if she had forgotten how to smile. When night came, everyone went to bed at the same time. Her mother, still curious, opened Isla's bedroom door slightly and said, "Turn off the lights." Her father checked the locks on the downstairs windows. Helen turned off the kettle in the kitchen one last time. Mara entered her room. Nothing seemed as if anything was about to happen. But toward dawn, Isla heard a sound. The sounds inside a house are usually familiar. One step of the staircase creaks, the pipes click, the wind passes through the chimney. This sound was not familiar. Bare footsteps, slow but determined. Someone was walking slowly through the house, without rushing, without bumping into anything. Isla sat up in bed. The door was slightly open. She looked into the hallway. Mara was walking, wearing her nightgown, her eyes half open, her hair falling over her face. Isla whispered, "Mara?" Mara did not turn. Isla said her name a little louder. Mara kept walking as if she had not heard. She went downstairs. The door lock clicked. The winter cold that suddenly entered the quiet house made Isla shiver for a moment. Isla jumped out of bed in panic and ran to her parents' room. Helen could not understand what was happening, but she got up in fear with sleepy eyes and woke Richard. The three of them hurried downstairs together. The door was open, and the wind entering the house echoed through the rooms. Outside there was fog. The direction of the cemetery could not be seen at all. From deep inside the darkness they suddenly heard, just for a moment, the distant sound of a crow. Once, then once again. As if something was calling, Richard immediately reached into the cabinet near the entrance and took his flashlight. Helen rushed outside without even putting on her coat in that panic. Isla ran after them to catch up. They passed the garden gate. They stepped onto the roadside. There was no wind, but the air was moving. Something seemed to be moving inside the fog. When they entered the cemetery path, the gravel crunched under their feet. That sound might have been the loudest sound in the entire night. After running for a long time and finally reaching the back of the church, breathless, Richard pointed the flashlight between the gravestones. At first they did not see Mara. Then Isla pointed. In the oldest part of the cemetery, Mara was sitting in front of a crooked gravestone. She had pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening carefully. She was listening the way someone listens when a person they care about is telling something important. But in the darkness of the night, and in that deserted place, no one was speaking. Helen ran to her. She was both frightened and heartbroken. "Mara," she said. Mara lifted her head. Her eyes were open, but she was not really looking. Her eyes seemed empty, yet they somehow looked as if they were seeing something. Helen gently held her by the shoulder. Without looking at her mother, Mara whispered, "I'm late. What are you saying?" Helen asked. Mara's voice seemed slightly deeper and darker. "He is still here," she said, "and so am I." Richard insisted on helping his daughter to her feet. Mara did not resist for a moment, but when she stood up, her eyes turned toward the gravestone. She seemed unwilling to leave it. It was as if she had made a promise and was now failing to keep it. Helen pulled her daughter by the arm and led her back toward the house. Mara walked emotionlessly and stiffly. She walked silently. But she did not stop looking back. When they returned home, they quickly took her to the bedroom to warm her up, clean her, and try to understand what had happened. Helen tried to make her drink some water. Mara wet her lips. "I shouldn't have gone there," she said, "but I have to. I go." It sounded as if the one saying those words was not really her. Then her eyes closed and Mara fell asleep. This time she truly slept, deeply and without interruption. When morning came, Mara looked at the faces of everyone in the house and said she remembered nothing about what had happened. She did not remember the cemetery at all. "Oh my God, you must be joking," she said with a slight smile. "Did I really go to the cemetery in the middle of the night?" Her father could not get angry with her because he felt that something strange had happened. He remained silent and thoughtful. Helen noticed the traces of soil on Mara's wrist. She saw the dirt under her fingernails. It was difficult to explain this as a dream. Something was wrong. Ayla, out of curiosity, wanted to look at that gravestone again. Everyone was certain that night the place where Mara had been sitting was not random. It was one of the stones in the oldest part of the cemetery. It was so old that even the letters carved into the hard stone had been worn down, yet they were still readable. Isla had never noticed it before. In the beam of the flashlight she had seen something. There was a hollow on the stone, as if something once written there had later been carved away and erased. And beneath the lower lines there was a date and a name: Sir Alaric Greymark. Isla had never heard that name before. She had spoken with many people in the village and listened to their stories and the stories of others, but there was no family called Greymark, nor had she ever heard the name. When she looked more carefully, she noticed that the shape of the stone was different. The other gravestones were simpler, rougher, the kind made by villagers. This stone had a faint carving on its upper part, like a hand holding a sword, or a hand praying. Ayla could not be sure. The fog left a slippery glow on the surface of the stone. That night it happened again. This time Helen was awake. She had left her daughter's bedroom door slightly open. As the clock approached 3, that soft sound of footsteps was heard again in the house. Helen got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. Mara was walking. This time her eyes were completely closed, but there was no hesitation in her steps. Helen grabbed her by the arm. Mara paused for a moment, but she pushed Helen's hand away as if pushing away the hand of a stranger. Without opening her eyes, she went downstairs. She opened the door. She stepped outside. Helen followed helplessly behind her. This time Richard woke up as well. The flashlight was taken immediately, and they went out. Isla ran again. The road to the cemetery was cold again, and Mara was once again sitting in front of the same stone. Something inside Helen broke that night, because this was not a coincidence. A person does not randomly stop in front of a stone while walking, especially not in a cemetery, especially not at night, especially not a child, and certainly not a girl who had disliked the cemetery even when she was young. Mara lifted her head and this time looked at Helen. Her eyes were not Mara's eyes. The color was the same, the shape was the same, but the feeling they carried was different. Mara's eyes usually looked as if asking, "What will happen next?" This gaze looked as if saying, "It is already too late." "His name," Mara said. "He won't leave me." Helen held her breath. "Who?" she asked. Mara pointed at the gravestone. "Alaric," she said, "or what he did." Richard tried to lift his daughter into his arms. Mara trembled for a moment. Then she whispered, "He isn't calling me," she said. "I am calling him." That sentence was like a stone thrown into the night. When it landed, it made no sound, but its impact was enormous. The next day, crows appeared above the house. At first there were only 1 or 2. Then suddenly, the number became 14 or 15. One morning, when Helen pulled the curtain aside, she counted 45 of them, lined along the edge of the roof. Crows normally existed in the village. They wandered through the fields, fences and trees, but so many crows circling above the same house was strange and frightening, especially with such persistence. The crows flew, then landed on the roof, then rose again, as if drawing an invisible circle above the house. Isla saw it when she returned from school. Her friend said, "They're just crows." But Isla felt a knot forming in her throat, because the crows were not only above the house. Sometimes they flew close to the windows, beating their wings against the glass, as if knocking, as if they were checking what was inside. That same evening, a sound came from the garden gate. Hard and repeating, something was repeatedly striking the gate. Richard went outside. He raised the flashlight. There were 2 goats standing in front of the gate. There were goat herds in the village, but they usually stayed in the fields. These goats had come right up to the house. They were hitting the gate with their horns. They looked angry, as if they were attacking something inside. Richard shouted. The goats stepped back, but they did not leave. They waited in front of the gate. The crows watched from the roof. For a moment the house seemed surrounded, as if it were a living thing. Helen's face turned completely pale. "There's no explanation for this," she said. Richard wanted to say, "There must be," but he could not. That night Mara walked again, but this time Helen and Richard stood like a barrier in front of the door to stop her. "Don't," Helen said. Mara opened her eyes. This time she was completely awake, and she was crying, quietly crying. "I don't want to," she said, "but my feet keep moving. It's like it's not me." Isla thought she saw something behind her sister. The hallway was dark, but within the darkness it seemed as if there was another shadow. Isla blinked. The shadow was gone. But the feeling inside Isla was harder to erase. In the morning, Helen went to the church. The priest of Saint Eadric Church was relatively young. His name was Father Thomas Kerr. He was of Scottish origin. Years ago he had come here through a reassignment. There was always a trace of weariness on his face, but when he spoke his voice was calm and steady. As Helen explained what had happened, she felt embarrassed hearing the words coming from her own mouth. A girl walking to the cemetery at night. Crows, goats, the same gravestone. Father Thomas first listened silently. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Bring Mara, and tell me the name on the grave." Helen said the name, Sir Alaric Greymark. The priest's eyebrows moved very slightly. It was the smallest possible gesture of saying, "I have heard that name before." "That name," the priest said, "appears in the stories of this town, but people prefer stories, not the truth." Helen's voice trembled with fear. "What story?" The priest opened the back door of the church. They walked toward the side facing the cemetery. The winter sun was pale. The cemetery looked cold, even in daylight. The priest pointed toward the oldest part of the graveyard. "Over there," he said. "Some gravestones have been replaced. Some names have been carved away. Some were deliberately forgotten." "Why?" Helen asked. "Because some people are cursed," the priest said. "Even after death, they continue to disturb the living, sometimes through what they did, sometimes through their names." When Helen returned home, the priest came with her. Father Thomas stopped when he saw the house. He looked at the roof. The crows were still there. For a moment the priest's eyes narrowed. Then he looked toward the garden gate. The goats were gone, but there were marks in the dirt beneath the gate. Horn marks, hoof marks, as if something had tested the gate throughout the night. Mara was sitting in the living room. When the priest entered, Mara's shoulders tensed. It was as if the priest's presence had awakened something. The priest sat across from her. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "Just tell me one thing. When you go to the cemetery, what do you feel?" Mara tried to speak for a few seconds but hesitated. Then her lips moved. "It feels familiar," she said. "The smell of the stone is familiar. The smell of the soil is familiar. Not from my childhood, from something older," Isla whispered, "like reincarnation." Mara looked at her. "I don't know," she said, "but sometimes a name appears, sometimes a face." "Alaric?" the priest asked. Mara nodded slightly. "Sometimes," she said, "but sometimes it isn't Alaric. Sometimes there is a man. I hear the sound of something like armor, the sound of metal, and a prayer, like a priest. But the prayer isn't beautiful. It doesn't feel like a prayer. It feels like someone locking something." The priest folded his hands on his knees. "What do you do when you sit by the gravestone?" he asked. Mara's eyes filled with tears. "I listen," she said. I wait for someone to come, for someone to find me, but no one comes. There is only a feeling, a very old feeling, like a debt." That day the priest told them not to go to the cemetery again. Mara said, "All right." But her voice did not sound like her own. That night, the first small thing happened to Father Thomas. He lived in the church residence. Late in the night he heard a sound coming from the bell tower. The bell did not ring, but there was a metallic tone, as if something had struck the metal. The priest got up and climbed the stairs. The bell tower was locked. The key was in his pocket. The door was locked, but from inside it sounded as if someone was slowly dragging a metal object across the surface of the bell. A long, scratching sound. The priest began to pray. After a short while, the sound stopped. When morning came, there were scratches on the bell tower door, not from the inside, from the outside, scratches as if someone had tried to open it. The priest told no one, because some things grow when they are spoken aloud. But it had already begun to grow. The next morning, Mara was found in her bed, but her feet were muddy. There was soil beneath her fingernails. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "How?" she said. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. Richard checked the lock on the back door. The lock was intact, but on the lock there was a thin black mark, as if something had been pressed against it, like a crow feather, but it was not a feather. It looked more like ash. Father Thomas visited the house again. He gave Mara a prayer text. "Do not read it," he said. "Just keep it with you. But the real matter is this. I need to investigate the grave." The town had a small archive. There were old records in the library, baptism books in the church, and documents kept in a damp room beneath the town hall. Father Thomas and Helen spent days searching through them. The name Greymark appeared in several places. A land dispute, a rumor about a duel, an unfinished sentence in the journal of a priest, and in one place a small note. Sir Alaric Greymark requested to be buried within church grounds. The request was accepted. However, the mark on the stone was later removed. Why was it removed? There was no record. The priest found an even older ledger, dated 1691. The pages had turned brown, the ink had faded. On one page there was a name, Alaric Greymark, and beneath it a single sentence. He confessed before his death. The full confession was not written down. While the priest was reading the ledger, he suddenly sensed the presence of a smell in the dim room. The smell of wet stone and a cemetery. A library should never smell like a graveyard. The priest lifted his head and slowly looked around. In the other corner of the room, it seemed as if a shadow was standing. It looked almost merged with the wall, but the darkness was distinct. It lasted only for a brief moment. Then it was gone. The priest blinked uneasily and looked back at the page. The ink now looked strangely darker than it had a moment ago, as if it had just been written. The priest closed the ledger and stepped outside. The air was cold, but the back of his neck and his shoulders were sweating. That night, an accident happened in the cemetery. Richard, no longer able to endure it, secretly went toward the cemetery path. "I'll break the gravestone," he had said. "I'll put an end to this nonsense." He carried a pickaxe in his hand. Idla had seen him leave. Her parents had argued earlier. Richard was not angry. He was afraid. His fear had turned into anger. He wanted to save his family from this disturbing problem. When he reached the cemetery, he raised the pickaxe. He was about to strike the stone. At that moment, a goat stepped out from behind the church. Just one goat. It stopped in front of Richard. Its eyes were not bright. They looked empty, dark, like death itself. The goat did not attack him. It did not behave aggressively. It simply lowered its head. Richard stepped back. The goat stepped forward. It was as if it was trying to push him away from the gravestone. After hesitating for a moment, Richard gathered his courage again. He lifted the pickaxe. All the crows screamed at once. Richard's attention broke for a second. His foot slipped. He stepped on the damp soil beside the gravestone and fell. He was lucky. His head could have struck the stone and killed him. The pickaxe flew out of his hand into the air and fell back down sharply, striking his knee. His knee began bleeding with pain. He cried out, but his scream disappeared inside the cemetery, as if the cemetery itself refused to let the sound escape. While Isla and Helen were bringing him back home, Richard kept repeating the same thing. "There was someone there," he said. "There was someone behind the stone." From that moment on, no one in the house wanted to be alone. One day, when Mara returned from school, she found a very old yellowed envelope at the door. There was no name on it, only the address of the house, and beneath it, written in trembling letters, a single word: debt. Mara opened the envelope. There was nothing inside. It was empty, but the inside of the envelope was stained with cemetery soil. The soil was the same as the dirt under Mara's fingernails. When Father Thomas saw the envelope, he fell silent. "This is not a game," he said. Helen replied, "After everything that has happened, of course it isn't." The priest decided to visit the gravestone at night. Perhaps he could understand the problem or find a way to solve it. It was not something most priests would do, but sometimes, to understand something, you have to step into the heart of fear. The priest knew that, or at least he thought he did. At midnight, Father Thomas went alone to the cemetery. In his hand was a flashlight, in his pocket a small cross, and on his lips a prayer. When he entered through the cemetery gate, the crows made no sound. That silence was worse than their cries. The crows seemed to be watching him, but they did not make a sound, as if they did not want to reveal themselves. As the priest approached the gravestone, he noticed something. In front of the stone, there was a very thin hollow in the ground, as if someone had knelt there again and again, carving the soil away. The priest shone the flashlight onto the ground. In the soil, he saw a small metal object, a rusted ring. It looked like a ring, but it was not exactly a ring. On it, there was a small cross symbol. It might have been a priest's ring, or perhaps a knight's oath ring. The priest picked up the ring. The moment he took it, the wind rose, the fog shifted. From behind the church came the sound of a goat, short, abrupt, then footsteps. The priest raised his head. In the old section of the cemetery, between the stones, a silhouette was standing. Human height, broad shoulders, something like a helmet on its head. The priest pointed the flashlight in that direction. The light trembled, as if even the flashlight itself had become afraid. The silhouette did not move. The priest hurriedly began to pray. He tried not to raise his voice. Something inside him told him that if he raised his voice, if he made the moment louder, everything would become more real. While he was praying, the silhouette suddenly took a step. When it stepped forward, the air around it blurred slightly. The priest stepped back uneasy. The silhouette took another step. The priest's heart began to race, and then from behind him a voice spoke, Mara's voice. "Leave him." The priest froze where he stood. When had Mara arrived? She should not have been there, but Mara was standing at the cemetery gate, in her nightgown, barefoot. Her eyes were open. This time she was not sleepwalking. She was conscious, and on her face there was a courage and determination that neither the priest nor her parents had ever seen before. "Mara," the priest whispered, "you should be at home." Mara smiled with pain, but the smile was not Mara's smile. "Home," she said. "That is not my home. That grave is my home." The ring in the priest's hand grew warm. It no longer felt like metal. It felt alive. The priest tried to throw the ring away. He could not. His fingers tightened. The silhouette took another step. Mara began to walk forward with determination. She approached the gravestone. She stopped. She did not sit this time. Instead, she knelt before the stone. She lowered her head, as if showing respect to someone, or surrendering to someone. "His name is not Alaric," Mara said. "That is only the name written on the stone." The priest held his breath. "Then who is it?" he asked. Mara lifted her eyes. "I don't know," she said. "Sometimes a knight, sometimes a priest, sometimes my husband, but whoever he is, they left me here." The priest's throat went dry. "Who left you here, Mara?" he asked. Mara did not answer, because in a cemetery, some questions have no answers, only echoes. Suddenly the silhouette disappeared. The fog thinned. The wind stopped. The crows screamed once and flew away. The priest tried to take Mara in his arms and bring her home. Mara pushed his hand away. "No," she said, "I will not go home. Home is killing me more." In that moment, the priest felt the shape of the truth changing. At first he had thought of it as a haunting, a spirit, a curse, a grave. But now it felt as if the grave was only a mirror reflecting something inside the house itself, as if the grave had begun pulling toward it something that had remained unspoken for years. The next day the priest became ill. It did not begin like a simple flu. It began suddenly. His head ached as if an iron ring were tightening around it. His hands trembled. Black feathers seemed to drift before his eyes. Crows circled above the church roof. Something struck the window of the priest's room. When he opened it, he found a small goat hair caught on the edge of the glass. Goats did not enter the church residence. Helen brought soup to the priest. "I'm fine," he said. But his voice was not fine. It sounded dry and rough, as if he had not spoken for a long time. "Mara has a connection to that gravestone," the priest said. "But this connection is not like a fairy tale. It is more like a memory, something that settles inside a person." "What are we going to do?" Helen asked. The priest closed his eyes. "Sometimes," he said, "solving something does not mean tearing it away. Sometimes solving something means learning to live with it." When Helen heard that sentence, she wanted to cry, because for a mother it sounded like acceptance, and acceptance feels dangerously close to loss. That week, small accidents began happening in the house. Glasses fell by themselves, doors closed when there was no wind. A cable burned in Richard's workshop, and a small fire started. Richard put it out, but his hand was burned. Isla nearly fell down the stairs and caught herself at the last moment. It was as if the house itself was slowly weakening the family, as if something was saying, "Look around you, fear me, know that I exist." Meanwhile, Mara grew quieter every day. She even asked to tie herself to the bed at night so she would not walk to the cemetery again. Helen refused. Richard placed lock after lock on the doors. Yet sometimes Mara woke in the morning with mud on her feet. Other mornings she woke as if she had never gone anywhere at all. But beneath her eyes there was a shadow like a cemetery. One night Isla sat outside her sister's room. She could not sleep. The door was slightly open. Mara was lying inside. Isla listened to her breathing. After a while Mara began to whisper. Isla pressed her ear closer to the door. Mara was not speaking English. The sounds coming from her mouth were in an old language. It sounded like Latin, but not exactly Latin. It was not like a prayer. It sounded more like an oath. And within that oath, one name kept repeating, Eadric. Isla's skin crawled. Because the church was called Saint Eadric, and no one could explain why an ordinary girl would whisper that name in her sleep. When Father Thomas heard this, his face turned pale. "Eadric," he said, "that is not a name used in this town. It is the name of the protector of the church, an ancient saint, or perhaps an ancient story." Helen said, "What if we take Mara away from here, to the city, to London, anywhere?" The priest slowly shook his head. "You can take her," he said, "but some things are not tied to places. Some things attach themselves to people." That night, Richard went to the gravestone again, but this time he was not carrying the pickaxe. There was no anger on his face either. There was only the helplessness of a father grieving for his child. He touched the stone. The stone was cold, but its coldness was not like that of an ordinary stone. It felt as if air that had not come out for a long time was slowly breathing from within it. Richard whispered, "What do you want?" There was no answer, but somewhere far away in the cemetery, the creaking of a door was heard. At first Richard thought it was the church door. Then for a moment he realized the sound seemed to come from his own house, as if the cemetery itself were opening and closing the door of his home. At that moment the keys in Richard's pocket began to tremble on their own. When he returned home, Helen was still awake. Isla was too. Mara was lying in her bed in her room, but her eyes were open. She was staring at the ceiling. "Mara," Helen said. Mara did not answer. After a moment she said only one thing. "Don't ask about him. Ask about the debt." Richard's throat went dry. "A debt?" he asked. Mara spoke slowly, as if the words were not entirely her own. "A promise was given. I am inside a lock. The name of the lock is Eadric. The key, the ring." Helen's face turned pale. "Which ring, Mara?" she asked. Mara closed her eyes. "He took it," she said. "The priest took it." At that moment Helen and Richard understood. That rusted ring from the cemetery was not simply an object. It was part of something, part of a rule. The next day Helen went to see Father Thomas. The priest's face was pale. He was trembling. Before Helen could even speak, the priest whispered to himself, "I made a mistake." "What mistake?" Helen asked. The priest took out the metal ring, wrapped in a piece of cloth. The ring no longer looked rusty, as if it had not been buried in the soil for days. It looked alive. The small cross engraved on it flashed briefly when the light touched it. "The night I took this," the priest said, "while I was praying, my tongue slipped." "How?" Helen asked. The priest cleared his throat. "I said the name Eadric," he said, "not like a habit, like an oath." Isla spoke up. "But Eadric is the name of the church. Why is that so important?" The priest looked at Isla. "Because," he said, "Eadric is not only the name of the church, it is the oldest seal of this town." Then for the first time, he explained the truth without hiding anything. In the archives of Saint Eadric Church, there was a small page that was never shown to tourists. Written in the late 1600s, half erased, the priest placed the page in front of Helen. 2 words could still be clearly read. Debitum. And beneath it, a trembling note that looked like English but was closer to Latin. "The debt is carried by a witness." The priest continued. "Sir Alaric Greymark requested to be buried here. The request was accepted. Later, the mark on his stone was removed, because that mark was not protecting him. It was locking something." Helen's voice cracked. "What was it locking?" The priest closed his eyes. "A sin," he said, "but not the sin itself, the echo of the sin." "What does that mean?" Isla asked. The priest chose his words carefully. "Some things do not die. Sometimes a person dies, but what they did continues breathing somewhere. Long ago this church knew how to seal that breath. But for the seal to work, something was required. A witness." Helen whispered, "A witness?" The priest nodded. "Yes," he said. "Someone must be there. Someone must say yes. The seal is carried through a human being. That is why Mara goes there every night. That is why she says, 'I'm late,' because the seal calls her back to the same place every night." Helen's hands trembled. "Was Mara a witness in the past?" she asked. The priest looked at the ring. "Worse," he said. "Mara was not the witness. Mara was the lock." "How?" Helen whispered. The priest answered softly. "She was used like a bride." That word cut through the house like a knife. Bride, marriage, debt. In that moment Helen understood why Mara sometimes spoke about warmth. Because that warmth had not been love. It had been the lingering memory of a ritual. The priest tried to put the ring back in his pocket. He could not. His fingers tightened. It was as if the ring had chosen his hand. Isla ran to Mara's room. Mara was in bed, but her lips were moving, and Mara was speaking that language again, older than Latin. Not like a prayer, more like an oath. Isla caught only one word. Debitum. Debt. That night, Helen stayed in Mara's room. She tried to sleep beside her daughter. Richard locked the doors twice. Isla left the light on. As the clock approached 3, the familiar sound of bare footsteps echoed through the house. But this time, Mara didn't seem to be walking. It felt as if someone was walking her. Helen grabbed Mara's arm. Mara's skin was ice cold. For a moment, Helen noticed a faint mark on her daughter's wrist. The thin scratch that once looked like it came from a thorn bush didn't look like a scratch anymore. It looked like a ring mark, a thin circular imprint, as if something had rested there long ago. "Mara," Helen whispered, "my girl, can you hear me?" Mara opened her eyes, but those eyes were not Mara's. Inside them was an old fear, and worse than that, there was recognition. Mara whispered, "I wasn't his wife." Helen held her breath. Mara continued, "I was the one he chose." "Who?" Helen asked. Mara's voice trembled. "Alaric." Then Mara's gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the room. Helen saw nothing there, but Mara did, because Mara's face changed for a moment, harder, older, someone else. Mara began speaking. Helen couldn't understand the words coming out of her mouth, but the images were clearer than the language. Mara was no longer in the room. She was inside the church. The smell of incense, stone walls, lantern light, and a man wearing armor. But there was no dirt from battle on it. Clean armor, clean sword. Helen suddenly remembered Mara's words. Clean swords hide the blood. The other Mara, the older one, was kneeling. Someone was placing a ring on her finger, but it wasn't a wedding ring. It was a sealing ring. A man's voice echoed through the church. It sounded like a prayer, but it wasn't a prayer. The words felt like something closing a lock, and at that exact moment a single word came out of Mara's mouth. Yes. When Helen heard that word, she nearly broke into tears, because that yes wasn't agreement. It was surrender. Tears rolled down Mara's face, but they weren't Mara's tears. They were the echo of a cry from centuries ago. Mara whispered, "They sat me on the stone." "Who sat you there?" Helen asked. Mara's jaw tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then the word came out. "The priest." Helen's blood ran cold, because that meant the story wasn't only about the night. It wasn't only about Alaric. The church had been part of it too. Mara continued, trembling. "Alaric did something. A woman died. Someone was silenced. But there was no blood, because the church cleaned it." Helen clutched her throat. "Who was that woman?" she asked. Mara looked straight at her, and the sentence she spoke was heavy enough to move everything in the room. "Me." Helen stepped back. "What do you mean, you?" Mara shook her head slowly. "I'm not that woman," she said, "but I took her place. I carried her debt." Helen finally understood. This wasn't some romantic reincarnation story. This was the inheritance of a crime, the price of something someone else had done, written into the body of someone innocent. Mara sobbed. "I wasn't his wife, Mom. I was his door." That night, for the first time, Mara did not walk to the cemetery, because the cemetery was now inside the house. Near dawn, Helen heard a small creak in the hallway. She rushed out. Mara was sitting in front of the house's entrance door, her knees pulled to her chest, exactly the way she used to sit in front of the gravestone, but this time there was no grave. And from Mara's lips came a single sentence: "The door has changed." Father Thomas called that morning. His voice sounded hoarse, as if a rope had been wrapped around his throat. "Helen," he said, "I tried to let go of the ring." "And?" Helen asked. The priest laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded dry, broken, uneasy. "I couldn't," he said. "Every time I tried to release it, my hand closed tighter. And yes, when I woke up during the night, there was soil between my fingers, as if I had been kneeling somewhere." Helen felt the air leave her chest. "So, is it passing to you?" she asked. The priest was silent for a moment. Then he whispered, "No, it isn't passing to me." "Then what is happening?" Helen asked. The priest took a slow breath. "It's looking for a witness." Helen felt her throat tighten. "When I picked up the ring," the priest continued, "I became the witness. The name Eadric came out of my mouth. At that moment, the debt was written again. That's why Mara told me, leave it. She knew the thing I picked up wasn't just metal. I didn't know, but she did." Helen asked quietly, trembling, "Will Mara be free?" The priest didn't answer immediately. There was a long silence. "I'm going to tell you something," he said finally, "but you won't believe me." "Tell me." The priest lowered his voice to a whisper. "This morning, there was an envelope at the door of my residence." Helen's heart already knew the word before he said it. "Debt." "Yes," the priest said. "But this time the envelope wasn't empty." "What was inside?" The priest hesitated, almost ashamed. "A lock of hair." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Whose hair?" "I don't know," he whispered, "but there was something in the hair." "What?" "Soil," the priest said, "an apple seed." Helen's eyes widened in fear, because in their garden stood an old apple tree, a tree that bore bright red fruit. This could not be coincidence. Helen couldn't say anything, because suddenly a thought appeared in her mind. This thing was not only tied to the cemetery, it was tied to the house, to the family, to the garden. Mara was standing by the window. They lived in a different house now, farther from the village, somewhere more modern, but Mara was still looking in the same direction, as if staring toward a cemetery that no longer existed. Isla pulled the curtain aside. A crow was sitting on the edge of the roof, then another, then a third. Helen wanted to say, "This is normal," but she couldn't, because the crows weren't flying. They were standing guard, and in front of the garden gate there were 2 marks pressed into the mud, like horn marks, but there were no goats here. That night Mara sat by the door again, her knees drawn to her chest, her head slightly tilted, listening. Helen whispered, "What are you listening to?" Without blinking, Mara answered, "The new terms." "What terms?" Mara replied calmly, "A debt is never paid. It is transferred." Isla felt her throat tighten. "To who?" she asked. For a brief moment Mara looked at Isla, and for the first time, Mara was truly there, only for a moment. Then the look disappeared. Mara whispered a single word. "Witness." Helen was about to say no, but something fell from the roof. A metallic sound. When they rushed outside, a rusted ring lay on the ground, the same ring, but this time it was not in the priest's hand. It was lying at their door, as if someone had placed it on the threshold, as if to say, "Now it is your turn." Helen couldn't touch it. Richard couldn't. Ayla couldn't either, but Mara slowly reached out her hand. "Mara, don't," Helen whispered. Mara stopped. Tears filled her eyes. For the first time she spoke completely as herself. "Mom, if I don't touch it, one day Isla will." A scream rose in Helen's chest, but it never came out, because sometimes fear does not squeeze the throat, it squeezes the conscience. Mara pulled her hand back. The ring remained on the ground, and at that moment a thin sound echoed inside the house, like a rope being pulled tight, as if something had become impatient, and then silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a waiting silence, as if something inside the house was holding its breath, as if something was still listening.